because there are going to be defects regardless of how thorough or how many years you try to prepare for this. There's always going to be some struggles, but really understanding the landscape of how the business functions as you are trying to mitigate any disruptions to the running business.
Growing a business requires a holistic approach that extends beyond sales and marketing. This approach needs alignment among people, processes, and technologies. So if you're a business owner, operations, or finance leader looking to learn growth strategies from your peers and competitors, you're tuned into the right podcast. Welcome to the WBS Podcast, where scalable growth using business systems is our number one priority. Now, here is your host, Sam Gupta.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the WBS Podcast. I'm Sam Gupta, your host and principal consultant at independent ERP and digital transformation consulting firm Elevate IQ. Whether to go for iterative deployment or big bang is always subject to debate. But one factor that is often missed is the number of issues you might get on the day of deployment, as well as the number of resources that you may require to avoid and control the impact of business disruptions. Most consulting companies would often advise against the massive rollouts. The smaller the deployment, the more manageable it is. But that may not always be possible due to the system architecture and the amount of additional temporary overhead that may be required to support a phased deployment. In today's episode, our guests, Nate and Jess Schisler, shares their insights on the Lululemon's case study of a massive rollout of their ERP and WMS. They also discuss the specific decisions that led to them opting for the one weekend rollout despite their system integrator advising otherwise. Finally, they share details about the architectural considerations and resulting inventory issues that required months of hypercare post-deployment. Let me introduce Jess and Nate to you. Jess and Nate have a combined 30 years of experience in global supply chain and enterprise systems. Prior to starting their consulting business, they worked together at Lululemon, where they met for nearly 5 years, launching a string of successful programs, including 4 Manhattan WMS deployments, a global RFID rollout, and a globally synchronous deployment of Oracle RMS. They have been married for nearly 3 years now, have a 10-month-old baby, Hudson, and recently purchased a home in central Ohio, which will serve as the home base for their family and their consulting business. With that, let's get to the conversation. Jess, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us. Really excited to be here.
Whenever I have 2 guests on the podcast, it's always so much fun because we get so much insight. And you guys are super deep in the warehouse processes. So it's going to be so much fun discussing that. Just to kick things off, do you want to start with your personal story and your current focus? Nate, I will start with you first.
Great. I mean, normally I would say ladies first, but I'm happy to go first. So Nate Schisler, I've been working in vertically integrated apparel supply chain for almost 2 decades now. Companies you've heard of like Eddie Bauer, DHL Supply Chain. A big part of today's discussion will focus around our time at Lululemon, where I worked for almost 7 years, opening distribution centers around the world for them. Current focus today, Jess and I actually have a consulting practice, which we'll probably talk about later in the show, but we do a lot of work focused specifically on the e-commerce industry and supporting brands that are launching circular programs and retail channels. So that's me, Jess.
Awesome.
Go ahead, Jess.
Well, I'm Jessica Schisler. I come from a non-traditional background when it comes to where I'm at now. So I originally studied law with the intention of going into law enforcement. I worked with Purolator, which is basically Canadian version of like a FedEx or a UPS. It's the largest carrier company in Canada. And I led their investigations. So everything from hijackings to working with different police forces to solve loss. I left Purolator, went over to Target Canada, which was a pilot for Target. Basically, we opened 124 stores in 18 months. We had 3 distribution centers. I led their work in building out their investigation tools within WMS and within their ERP system. And then I transitioned over to a very obvious space for me, which was continuous improvement and distribution. Most of people would know what happened with Target Canada. There was many issues within our ERP system and our processes. And after 3 short years, we got shut down. And that left me and 19,000 other people scrambling on what's next in our careers. I looked around and I decided I was going to leave Toronto and move over to Vancouver and join Lululemon. I was with Lululemon for 6 years, and I was in their finance department, leading inventory control. And we had some pretty spicy deployments underway. We had our ERP system, which we launched. We had RFID, which we launched globally. But specifically with the ERP system, I worked really closely with Nate on the supply chain side, me on the requirements, testing, cutover, deployment, and then the never-ending, defects that you live in. So that was very fun, very challenging, grew a bunch. And then with RFID, we decided, we had RFID in our stores. We leveraged that for our inventory accuracy. And we decided to cut off Wiz and Regis for our traditional stock counts and use RFID. So those are some of the bigger projects that I took part in, as well as the Like New pilot, which is the direction that Nate and I have taken our own business. And then recently we had our first baby daughter, Hudson, in August. And with that came a change in perspective. And I joined Nate in our side hustle, which is now our main hustle. And now we're running our own show called Maven Circular. And that's a fast forward version of how we got to where we are right now.
So first off, congratulations to both of you. And Nate, I also like to do the ladies first. But when it comes to the softball questions, I already target those to men. And then, hard questions are going to be reserved for ladies. Okay. So the next question is going to be for Jess.
Okay.
So
perfect.
So one of the things that we do here is going to be a very standard question that we ask every single guest has, and that is going to be your perspective on business growth. And I'm going to start with Jess.
Yeah. So business growth, I'm a very reserved person when it comes to risk. I am someone that likes to assess and evaluate and set new goals and reevaluate. I think if a business decides they don't want to grow anymore, that's okay. And in terms of growth, when a business is hungry to continue to move forward and growing, I would say with caution. And, I've worked for some businesses that were very aggressive, like Target, and Lululemon is very aggressive in how quickly they create change. And I am, I always come in and asking the questions around the data. Where's the data? Let's look at the data. Let's pilot something, a true pilot without intention of rolling out, just to actually gauge the value and if it's actually hitting the KPIs and metrics that are considered success. And so I'm more of a growth at a relatively slow pace. I can support fast pace, and I have for several years. But personally, I'm someone that really appreciates the data and understanding and making sure that everyone is keeping in mind what those metrics are for success.
Amazing. Nate, do you want to add your perspective?
Yeah, when Jess said that she was supporting fast growth the last few years, I think she meant me specifically. I'm definitely more of a ready, fire, aim kind of person. But in terms of sage business advice that can come from our combined experience, I would say scrappy and cheap don't necessarily have to mean the same thing. I think a lot of brands that are in a growth phase think those terms are synonymous. And my advice to a company that's contemplating, an inflection point as it pertains to their growth is it's okay to be scrappy, but don't be cheap. Don't sell yourself short when you're investing back into the business. And as a result of that perspective, if you're not ready to invest in a big way financially, then your business probably isn't ready to make that kind of tipping point change. So maybe wait a little bit longer, maybe bank a little bit more profit until you can reinvest it back into the company. Because what we've seen many times is that businesses try and take this kind of like cheap mindset when it comes to investing in systems or processes or large structural changes. And then what they end up doing is they end up getting a solution that is really just a mirror image of what they had before. And then they go through, multiple years of defects and enhancements, which is way more expensive than just investing a little more upfront the first time.
I couldn't agree more. And I am simply going to build on this one. So when you look at any sort of WMS or ERP implementations, those are probably going to be the tipping point change in any company's life cycle. And, one of the things that we wanted to cover as part of this episode is going to be your Lululemon story of the ERP deployment. So your recommendation is go scrappy, but overall from the company perspective, I don't think they actually went scrappy in terms of the operating model that they had for the project. So I don't know, Amici, this is probably a good start in terms of painting the color in what happened overall with the project. So I don't know. I mean, Jess is probably going to have a richer background from the requirement perspective. So Jess, do you want to start painting the story about the project? What was this about? And then we can come back to Nate and he can add value from the supply chain perspective.
Yeah, sure. So we had a great internal resource that was leading the project on the Lululemon side, Daniel Andrew. He was in a difficult position coordinating. I think anyone who's in that role really has a tough time leading an ERP deployment of large scale, global, one-day cutover. So, working with him really closely over the last couple of years, my time at Lululemon, there was definitely a lot of push and pull from, you have the Accenture side. So Lululemon used Accenture for the deployment. And then we had internal resources, which were just a handful of people that were dedicated. And like most ERP solutions and deployments, you have a lot of people working off the side of their desk. Both Nate and I, that was kind of our role. My role was, at the end of once we deployed, it was now potentially my problem or something that was working smoothly for us. So that's, resourcing and ensuring that there's a dedicated time for training and that change management was really important for us. And ensuring, I think, an area that anyone walking into an ERP deployment really understanding what does it mean, not necessarily like the system, but like what does it mean for how the business is going to change, how we function, how we collaborate cross-functionally with different teams. That needs to be done up front before we even get into how do you prioritize different functions and whatnot. So I'd say that were some of the bigger things for me personally that was a bit of a learning there. And we ended up having to push the dates back a couple times, which I think is, when it needs to happen, it needs to happen. You don't want to go prematurely and walking out with like known issues, because there are going to be defects regardless of how thorough or how many years you try to prepare for this. Is always going to be some struggles. But really understanding, the landscape of how the business functions as you are trying to mitigate any disruptions to the running business, because obviously you don't want that to happen, and to mitigate that as much as possible.
Sam, maybe I could set the stage a little bit more broadly for you. I mean, the Lululemon's ERP project really began in 2014 when I joined the organization. And so while we think of the effort around the ERP as a 12 or 18 month project, Lululemon had grown to a point where in early 2000, they had started using a merchandising platform known as MMS. And then they continued to modify and enhance that merchandising tool to become their ERP. They were also using it as their warehouse management system. And so before they could even contemplate deploying RMS, they had to untangle themselves from using this highly modified instance of MMS, which they had grown to become, a $2 billion global company using this hacked together modified merchandising platform as their ERP and their merchandising tool and their WMS. So for the 3 years leading up to the start of the ERP project, my role at the company was going DC to DC and getting them off of MMS and converting them over to Manhattan WMS. So we had to get every corporate DC in North America and Australia off of onto a new WMS. And that's when we could actually start the work of like getting ready to deploy RMS. So it was really like almost a 4-year project with like 3 years of corporate, prep to get all the DCs off of, basically they were running their DCs off of their ERP. So get them off of their ERP so they could then change over the ERP. And then the decision around like the approach to that deployment, back to my earlier comment about scrappy versus cheap, I would never advise anybody to do a coordinated global every market at the same time cut over to your ERP. But that was the decision that we made because from a cost standpoint, it was the most cost effective way to do it, but definitely not for the faint of heart. When you think about like coordinating the shutdown of all of your DCs across all time zones in the US, that takes a rolling 24-hour period. Then you have a deployment cycle that takes 24 to 48 hours, and then another 24 hours to start all of your DCs back up, one by one in testing. You're really talking like kind of a 5-day sustained cutover effort to do every single market in one big go. But that's just to give you kind of like the 35,000 foot view of that project, which was actually about a 4-year long effort, starting with the supply chain side of it, which is where I was working.
I really appreciate that, to be honest. Now it is going to be slightly better picture overall for the listeners, but I'm pretty sure they are going to have a lot more gaps there in understanding, okay, so we are talking about using merchandising platform as the ERP, then we are doing a little bit of, upgrade onto the WMS system. In this particular case, the Manhattan is going to be the WMS system. So what is happening with the accounting side of things? I don't know, Jess, if you are going to have any sort of insights there. What was the accounting platform before? Did they, come with the newer accounting platform? I don't know if it is the SAP S/4HANA installment, and I don't know if you sort of had the integration model between your WMS and the S/4HANA. How many different vendors were involved for doing that? Is that all part of Accenture? So do you want to provide some more colors there?
Well, Lululemon used Oracle as their accounting platform. And they went through an update in 2021. So I wasn't a part of that project. But prior to that, Lululemon had MMS, the original ERP system, going into Oracle. And then when we converted over to RMS, our new ERP system, they just reconnected it into the existing Oracle. So we just reconciled our old ERP to our new ERP system as we were working through that and ensuring there wasn't going to be any blips from an accounting perspective.
In that like transitionary period leading up to that cutover, you went from a model where your inventory of record and your WMS were the same system, that system being
Correct.
MMS. And so, so building by building, you had to carve off, this was what I was doing and how Jess and I first met. You had to carve off one building at a time and say, okay, now this building's inventory lives in WMS with an integration back to MMS. And then now the next building's inventory lives in WMS with an integration back to MMS. And you had to do that until all of the buildings had been carved off of that inventory of record. And then you could get to the point where you could go to that, deploying an ERP and synchronizing between the systems. So there was a period of time where like when the DC made a change to inventory, that it was actually changing the accounting inventory of record, like instantaneously, because it was in the same system. There was no checks and balances between the two.
Very interesting. So I don't know if there was a phase where somebody sat down and sort of, painted the holistic picture of the entire architecture. It doesn't seem like anybody did that. So basically, Nate, let's say if I understand this right, and any of you can chime in on this, okay? Whoever has far more background based on supply chain or the finance. So let's say if I'm looking at this, as the sort of the solution architect person, that, okay, you are trying to build an architecture, you have many different systems, and you are actually trying to manage all your inventory inside each of the DC, and you are sort of, trying to isolate that, but you need the financial information to be able to do your inventory. You are not simply counting, because finance is probably going to need that as well for the product costing. So how was that exchange happening? Who was doing that? Was it part of your WMS system? Was it part of your whichever ERP system, I don't know,
Yeah.
who was playing the role of ERP here.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about, so if you think about a really simple system context diagram, prior to 2014, if you were to map out the system context diagram for inventory at Lululemon, it was one box. And that one box was MMS. That was how we cut POs. That was where we held our inventory of record. That's where we held landed cost, MSRP. And that's also, believe it or not, where we held inventory location at the DC level. There was literally just one box. MMS did everything. And then in late 2013, early 2014, we said, okay, we need to get out of this world. Like, this isn't scalable for a company the size, even the size we were then. And so the system, the future state system context diagram became a WMS and an ERP and an integration layer in between. But to get to that model, you had to separate your inventory location tool, which what we call WMS. You had to separate that from your ERP, and then you can change out your ERP, because you would never use Oracle RMS to like pick, pack, and ship in the warehouse. But Lululemon was using this merchandising tool that had been highly customized to actually like pick, pack, and ship inventory. And it was the accounting inventory of record at the same time. So your system context went from like one box to two boxes with an integration layer in between, and then you were able to change out that second part.
Very interesting. Jess, do you have anything?
And then of course, there's like 50 boxes of inventory. So like Nate's talking about like the very specific component of like inventory position, where if you like take a step back, Lululemon's integration layers, multi-system, Accenture did take care. Accenture, in collaboration with our PM who was managing Lululemon's ERP conversion, they were working really closely to consider all of the upstream and downstream implications of the ERP system that we were moving into. A good way to obviously think about it is like, I think a quote that was going around at Lululemon for a couple of years as we were living the life of conversion was doing like open heart surgery on a moving plane or something like that. And it was basically that. From a scale perspective, there's hundreds of millions of dollars of inventory that needed to be converted. You had 600 plus stores. You have, I think at the time we had like 8 physical DCs, maybe 7 at the time, and both e-com and retail and a bunch of other DC channels in our distribution center. So, pausing all of that to be able to convert and then consider the up and downstream integrations and considerations there. Having that all mapped out is super critical and having a successful deployment.
Really interesting. And overall, from the core structure perspective, and I don't know, how deeply Accenture was engaged in this project, and I don't know who was really driving it from the get-go. I don't know if multiple departments were sort of, they were driving different initiatives, and maybe that's the reason why everybody sort of landed in this situation. So who was the driver of this project, and what were the other projects that were running in parallel which may have caused some of the conflict? Nate, do you want to start?
Take that? Yeah, I can.
Go ahead, Nate.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, when I started at Lululemon as the supply chain side of the project, so the conversion to Manhattan WMS, it was actually being driven by the IT org. And it was because at the time, the IT org kind of owned that system roadmap of like, we need to bring in a world-class ERP. In order to do that, we have to do all these other things. And so it started as a IT initiative.
Okay.
And then once all of the corporate DCs were off of the ERP and using a proper WMS, that's when I think, Jess, it really transitioned to be like a finance-led initiative.
Yeah, because the dependency there was the WMS complexity. So once we launched all of those Manhattan sites, it really enabled the finance team to really own it, start to finish, and that's when we partnered up with Accenture on the detailed deployment plan.
Very interesting. And how about supply chain and the operations? Were they involved? How about sales and marketing? I think they need to be impacted as well, right? Because you have 600 different stores here. So they have to do the merchandising as part of this as well. And I don't know if they really had sort of that centralized view of the inventory, because Nate is talking about just one piece of the inventory, but then you are talking about a little bit of centralized view of the inventory. But when everything is going to be all over the place, I don't know how you get that centralized view of inventory that you need for the merchandising and planning.
Yeah, so merchandising and planning, they have their own system, and they were just pulling it would get auto pulled every day into their snapshots from the existing ERP system. So they were involved in the in requirement gathering. They were involved in all of the different phases throughout the deployment, so they knew what was happening. They knew they had to pull up some POs, or they had to pause some POs because we had to halt all the inventory during that cutover period. So the merchandisers, we had a handful of them that were like the leadership that was involved with the finance team very closely. We also had later in the project, we had different distribution head, folks from those orgs that were involved because there was dependencies on them, not shipping after this day or not fulfilling orders after this day. So basically the finance team, in collaboration with some of the supply chain functions, we created the plan. And once we created the plan and all of the considerations within the plan on how are we going to make this happen with minimal impact to our e-com guests, and what was going to come on the screen when they were going to be ordering. And I think we did a really good job at Lululemon ensuring that not too many teams were involved where they didn't have to contribute anything. We would share that this was coming down the pipeline and this is how it would impact you, but we would keep them out of the weeds, really. And then that really enabled us to be able to continue with our timeline and ensure that, your role in the project is, if you think another team needs to be engaged, like put your hand up and let's communicate. And there was a couple times where, we learned we needed to involve a few other teams in a decision. But I think, that learning only helped us grow stronger and move forward. So I would say the finance team really led it in collaboration with a handful of folks from merchandising and the supply chain team.
And Sam, you were pressing into an interesting point there. I was thinking about as Jess was just speaking. When you think about like a global view of inventory accuracy and what inventory is positioned where, there was one experience. Lululemon always wanted to maintain the accuracy of the website because you don't want to have that like stock out experience. That's a really bad guest experience. And so there was always an emphasis to make sure that the storefront was looking at the most current snapshot of inventory, very tight integration between the storefront and the WMS. And frankly, the black hole of inventory, Jess's world, she lived through this world for many years. The black hole of inventory was always on the store side. And so the store inventory got, over the course, when you go from physical inventory to physical inventory, that was kind of where the store was like the sacrificial lamb of like inventory systems. And it did make it tough for the merchandising and planning teams because they always knew that they were often planning into an inventory position that was inaccurate, and really like inaccurate by design, because if you had to choose, you always wanted to make sure that the storefront had the most accurate inventory. So guests aren't, they're giving you the credit card and they're paying in advance. It's a really bad guest experience when you send an email and say, hey, I don't have this. But like if they walk into a store and you don't have it, you might miss a sale, but you can still maintain a good, guest experience and pivot them to something else.
Yeah, could not agree more. I mean, go ahead, Jess.
I was going to say, and to that point, I mentioned RFID, and Lululemon used RFID for our perpetual ledger for many years. So stores would go in and they would have RFID handhelds. They would scan all of our product on a weekly basis, actually, very frequently. And that would update the perpetual ledger, which would then support the merchandisers, really ensure that they're planning against accurate inventory. Eventually, we went over to our stock count and updating our stock ledger with RFID. But for us, we made sure that we had an accurate snapshot ahead of the cutover period. So we actually did a stock count before we got into cutting over. And really that was to ensure that from a financial risk perspective, we knew what was in inventory, a few weeks before cutover, then instead of depending on something that happened, 6 months ago. And when you have shrink rates that are, in and around 3%, and you haven't done a stock take in 6 months, the risk is quite high there. So, before we actually got into the weeds of cutting over, we did a stock count, which then gave us the confidence of the inventory position before and after the conversion.
Amazing. And whose idea was it to do the massive cutover? And I don't know if there was a debate in terms of doing the massive cutover versus not doing the massive cutover. So do you want to paint some colors there? What was the debate like, and what were the decision making in doing the massive cutover?
At a high level, I would say Accenture advised on not doing a mass cutover. Okay. Where Lululemon felt like, based off of the cost, like just cost mitigation and savings, and also just how our supply chain functions, that's where they believed one cutover was going to be the best way. Lululemon also, which uniquely, I think, has only one ERP system globally. So instead of having an ERP system in Europe and in Asia and then in North America, we actually functioned with one. It made some interesting things occur with, time zones and end of day snapshots, but that was Lululemon's position. And I don't think I get much more colorful than that, unfortunately, on that topic.
Yeah, I mean, as you're asking that question, Sam, like who made the decision? I would say it was nobody on this call. Nobody in this conversation made that decision. It's one of those things where looking back on it, you can say, yep, it worked, and let's never do it again that way. It worked. It's not something I would ever advise someone or an organization to do. I understand why we did it. I think because we were willing to sacrifice accuracy and visibility on the retail inventory position, I think that's probably what enabled it to happen, because we had this, you heard Jess refer to the perpetual ledger. We had this secondary inventory pool that we were capturing our inventory position in using RFID. So there was a period of time where Lululemon was maintaining two pools of inventory on the retail side. There was the accounting stock ledger, like what we report, our SEC filings. But then there was this other pool of inventory that was being maintained in parallel via RFID. And that's what the merchandising team was using. And so I think because we had that pool of inventory for most stores, certainly the North American stores at the time, and because we had a really refined process for keeping the e-com inventory accurate, I think that's what enabled a decision like shut down your global supply chain and cut over to one ERP in one big long weekend. I think if one of those two components was missing, the whole thing would have fallen apart. It definitely backed Lululemon into some pretty tough corners when you think about overnight batch processing. You have a very narrow window now because all your markets are using the same ERP. And so if you're going to do off hours processing, there's not many hours in the middle of the night that are off hours when you think about a global organization. So definitely some challenges in the early days of batch processes not getting complete in time, and then markets coming online and needing to access the system. And it's definitely not the easiest way to do an ERP deployment.
So you made a very interesting comment there about the long weekend and cutover doing over the long weekend. And typically in the ERP community, if you ask anyone, they are going to advise not to do anything over long weekend. In fact, take out one day before, one day after. Just don't do anything there, because you are not going to find a lot of people that are going to be super critical in making those decisions. And that's the advice typically we have in the ERP WMS community. So now, in your case, you actually decided to do it over the long weekend. Did you find all of the people that you needed? What if somebody just says that, I had plans and I want to go, and now do you sort of, call them back, and then are you going to tell them that, you're not going to have a job tomorrow if you don't show up?
Yeah, Jess, you might remember, I said long weekend. I didn't actually mean, I don't think we did it over a holiday weekend.
It felt long.
It was just
it felt long.
Yeah, it was just a very long weekend.
Yeah. So my team was the team that reconciled. We had two halves of the team. We had a store team that reconciled all store inventory, and all in transit inventory.
Yeah.
And then we had a team that reconciled all distribution. Inbound POs maintained the same just because they were not received yet. And I would say, I think between myself and my partner, me and my team worked some very long hours that the Canadian labor business would not appreciate. I would say it's definitely north of 12 hours. And I would say Accenture was with us the whole time, and they were a great partner to work with. But I would say that we did some practice cutovers ahead of it to really learn and understand, how to navigate when there's discrepancies. How do we, at what drill down do we get down to? We're not going to go down to the, unique SKU number and style number and size of a shirt in one store when we have 600. So, really aligning on what is that reasonable number that we're going to reconcile up into against, I think really helped us work smoothly. But we did identify, some missing information, and which is, I think, pretty typical, and, navigating that through the conversion rather than after the conversion. So that would, I think my advice there is lots of coffee. Team culture is really important. I think, our teams were, this was like the Super Bowl for us. And, we knew, like, if anyone was getting sick, we were going to probably be in a bit of trouble. I'm pretty sure I gave everyone some vitamin C a couple days leading up to make sure that we were all going to be healthy and happy, ready to go. But I would say that getting ready for that and ensuring that your resources are, they understand and that commitment is there. Choosing your resources for this critical time is really important. So that was how we approached it.
The reason we keep talking about it as this long weekend is when you think about doing a globally coordinated cutover, every cutover step requires a full 24-hour cycle because you've got to touch every market.
Yep.
So 2 days before the ERP deployment, my team's responsibility was to get every single DC to ship, clean, and shut down. And that takes a full 24-hour cycle because you've got to talk to every market one by one and go through their end of day. And then we hand it off to Jess's team and the project team to deploy and reconcile. And then one by one, we have to test every single market once they come back online. So it's every 2 hours, you've got a Zoom call with the next market saying, okay, can you receive one unit? Can you pick one unit? Can you ship one unit? And then we're checking to make sure it lands. So your cutover on top of all of the technical deployment is also extended because every cycle in the cutover takes a 24-hour cycle to get through every single market and make sure they're all working.
Only thing we can take right now is going to be the closing advice. So I don't know who want to start. So so closing advice, please.
Yeah, I'll start. So I think something that came up for me that, some of the things I'm going to bring up are learnings, and some of them are just what I would suggest. I think overall Lululemon's approach worked, and it's something that I would really encourage other folks as they're approaching this is, having hypercare lined up, ensuring that there's hypercare for at least a month. There's some actions that don't happen every day. So ensuring that you have a hypercare team that is dedicated, they're not working off the side of the desk, and they're focused primarily on that. Number two is really having a business owner to take over the product. And that gets identified, and you have a resource that, is skilled to do that. And then three is having, this might be a phased approach. You might have one or two resources at the beginning, but having someone to log and prioritize for the entire business defects, and how do they get prioritized for correction and then for retesting. Retesting, you're bracing for this cutover period, and you have all these extra resources, and you have the time to really do a clean cutover. But where I spent the last year and a half of my career at Lululemon was really in this hypercare, identifying defects, working with the team to come up with the requirements on how something needs to get corrected and what the outcome has to be, and then testing that and ensuring that each team has those resources to do that, especially your QA team. And a team that is going to be not just the finance team, but like you need all the cross-functional folks to have those resources to be able to make those changes when there's defects. And then the product owner to then really map out what does the next 2-3 years look like in collaboration with the cross-functional teams. Really I would encourage like I think there's a lot of focus that happens like right in that for that conversion and for the leading up to the conversion, and where I think I can see a lot of gaps happening with companies, including Lululemon, is really what happens after and who owns it and where's those funds and how do you create those business cases, and do you have the resources with the right skills to ensure that the business is still moving forward and they're not just going to live in this land of brand new, ERP system, but there's, the evolution of that and moving forward with it and correcting, new defects and identifying new defects. It's pretty critical in ensuring you're not just creating an ERP system that is a solution for one snapshot at a time, and then you're moving on in life and the ERP system isn't growing with the business.
Okay, amazing. Nate, what is going to be your closing advice, please?
Yeah, two things. One, surround yourself with good advisors and listen to them. I would be cautious to say or careful to say, like, listening to them doesn't mean that you need to do what they suggest, but you still need to listen. So solicit the input of folks who have been there, whether that's the consulting firm that you engage to support your deployment, or maybe that's hiring a key resource in your organization. At the end of the day, your audience is full of business leaders who it's their job to make the call as to how a deployment is going to go down. I'm not suggesting that you should let your advisors make that call for you, but at least make sure you're getting good input from all perspectives and not one perspective. And then the second thing I would say is don't just build a better version of what you're currently doing. If you're contemplating an ERP deployment or any major corporate system deployment, the worst thing you can do, in my opinion, is to just take your current business process and replicate it in that new system simply because it's easier. Because then what you end up doing is you spend 3 times as much money on the back end with, enhancement requests and really like dissatisfied business partners who are looking for new functionality, who weren't heard in the original scoping sessions. And, unfortunately, I watched Lululemon do this twice. I watched them do it with their WMS, where their WMS was built to replicate the workflow of their kind of hijacked ERP WMS. And I watched them do it with their ERP, where their new ERP was built to replicate the workflow of their old ERP. And then, going through multiple years of like trying to justify why you want to change it. There's a magic moment where you have the opportunity to change your business process, and that moment is sometime before you start configuring your solution. And this is where my comment at the onset of the call about like don't be cheap. To me, that's being cheap. Take this as an opportunity to really reinvent and future-proof your business, not just get off one burning bridge and onto another.
Amazing. And my personal takeaway from this conversation is going to be that you need to listen up very closely when someone says that do not do massive cut over, because they really mean it. Okay. They are trying to avoid the sleepless nights for you. So listen up closely. On that note, I want to thank both of you for your time and insights in this episode. This was a powerful episode.
Of course.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thanks. We really enjoyed it.
I cannot thank our guests enough for coming on the show, for sharing their knowledge and journey. I always pick up learnings from our guests, and hopefully you learned something new today. If you want to learn more about them or Maven Circular, or are interested in the circular economy, or need any help with any aspects of your supply chain, check out their website at mavencircular.com. It's mavencircular.com. Or you can reach them by email at go@mavencircular.com. It's go@mavencircular.com. Links and more information will also be available in the show notes. If anything in this podcast resonated with you and your business, you might want to check other related episodes, including the interview with Tim Harrison, who discusses various ASRS systems and why they are essential to increase the productivity of a warehouse. Also, the interview with Kevin Lawton from the New Warehouse podcast, who discusses why standardization plays a key role in inventory planning. Also, don't forget to subscribe and spread the word among folks with similar backgrounds. If you have any questions or comments about the show, please review and rate us on your favorite podcasting platform or DM me on any social channels. I'll try my best to respond personally and make sure you get help. Thank you, and I hope to get you on the next episode of the WBS Podcast.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the WBS Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform so you never miss an episode. For more information on growth strategies for SMBs using ERP and digital transformation, check out our community at WBS.rocks. We'll see you next time.